in verse 33 and 34. If you read verse 33 and 34, God says He will put His laws into people's minds. He will write it on their hearts. He will forgive their sins, and He will remember their sins no more. The new covenant is God's will, God's action, and God's heart, and God's initiative. The image that comes to my mind about God writing His commandments in people's heart is the movie 10 Commandments. In the movie 10 Commandments, Moses took those 2 stone tablets that God told him to make. He went up to the Mount Sinai, on top of Mount Sinai. He gave the 2 stone tablets to God. And God took those 2 stone tablets, and vividly, if you remember, God's finger started writing on those 2 stone tablets of His commandments. You know what? The commands on the 2 stone tablets are not erasable because it's written on a stone. In the same way, God is going to write His commands, His laws, into our hearts, into His people's hearts, that will not be erasable either.
Amen.
The new covenant is a covenant of grace. God is taking initiative even as people have failed Him. God's love, mercy, and grace compels Him to create this new covenant of grace. People did not deserve this unconditional covenant. But God wants to love His people. God wants to bless His people. The result of this covenant of grace is a restoration of relationship between God and people. The key word in verse 33 is the word be. The Lord will be their God, and Israel will be His people. No more conditions. Israel will always, always, always be God's people. In verse 34, God says, people will know the Lord. Teaching about the Lord is no longer necessary because everyone will know the Lord. Today, when we think about knowing something, we always think about knowledge. I know my wife because I know what she looks like. I know her personality. Knowledge is about knowing in the mind. But knowing is also a first-hand experience. I know my wife because I've lived with her for the past 11 years. I know what she likes and what she dislikes. In the same way, God is inviting people to have a first-hand experience with Him. Most of the Israelites know God's name. And most of the Israelites know God's commands. But they have not interacted or communicated with God. God is saying He wants His people to experience Him and to communicate with Him. In addition, knowing is about the heart. Israel had knowledge about God, but they did not know God from their hearts. In the Old Testament, God says, David was a man after God's own heart. David knew God's heart. Even though David failed God and failed people many times, but his heart, he had a heart connection to God. In this passage, God is saying all people will know Him and know His heart. People's hearts will be connected to God's heart. Finally, in verse 34, God will forgive people's sins and will remember their sins no more. In the Old Testament, we all know that once a year, there's a Day of Atonement, which is also called Yom Kippur, which also today it's also one of the biggest holidays for the Jewish people. And on the Day of Atonement, people offer sin sacrifices by killing animals to atone for their sins. That happens once a year. And also, when people defile themselves by touching something that's unclean, like a dead animal, they have to go through the daily ritual washings to cleanse themselves. And when people have recovered from unclean diseases like leprosy, they have to run to the priest to prove their uncleanness. So if you remember in the New Testament, Jesus healed the 10 lepers. So those 10 lepers had to run to the priest to show that they're clean. Here in the New Covenant, what God is saying is that under the New Covenant, no more sacrifice needed. No more daily ritual washing needed. No more running to the priest to prove their holiness or their cleanness. God will forgive their sins and forget people's sins. Wow! This new covenant is a really wonderful news for all people. The result of a new covenant is grace, is love, and is forgiveness.
Amen.
I have even better news. This new covenant is already fulfilled.
Amen. Yes.
Amen.
Amen.
This new covenant is fulfilled by the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So now let's look at the New Testament. So if you go to next, in Matthew chapter 26, verse 27, 28, it says, I'm reading from the New King James Version. As they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, Take, eat, this is my body. Then he took the cup,